Hello, I'm Bob Matheny, Mayor of the town of Zebulon, and this, guess what, is the Zebulon Mayor Show. Glad to have you today. Joining me is Joe Moore, Town Manager. Joe, glad to be with you again on TV. We're going to talk about money today and talk about expenditures, revenues, budget, kind of a teaser as to what's going to be coming up at our retreat as well. So, Joe, I'm going to let you kick it off and we'll go from there.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. As you mentioned, we've got the Board of Commissioners retreat coming up, and that'll be the first Thursday and Friday of March. And typically what we like to do is use that time to prepare ourselves for what we're going to present to the board at budget, get some feedback from them, not on all the things we're going to present, but some of the key items that we want to present. And what we're lining up right now as the things that we want to present are those projects or those policies that are either going to grow our property tax base or that are going to protect our property tax base. And the reason that's a primary importance, as we'll see in this video prepared by the North Carolina League of Municipalities, is the responsibility for providing services that are critical to cities like police and fire and public works is increasingly falling on the property tax to provide those services. So it's probably a real good introduction to this topic of money if we take a look at that video from the North Carolina League of Municipalities.
Okay, well, let's take a look at it.
Some people see vision as something seen in a dream, but to us, vision is the ability to think about and plan for the future. It's about knowing what every citizen from every front porch and storefront needs and wants, and having the flexibility to meet those unique challenges, combined with those of the diverse cities and towns throughout our great state. It's about celebrating where we live and what we do, and then building an economic future to support both for generations to come. For decades, cities and towns and the investments they have made have fueled economic growth in North Carolina. Those investments can be seen in the city's streets, the water and sewer systems, and other infrastructure that brought mills, banks, and a range of businesses to our state. They can be seen today in the parks, museums, and other amenities that are so key to a great quality of life. Today, more than 80% of jobs are located within North Carolina municipalities, and 75% of all retail business activity in the state originates in municipalities. Yet only 36% of local sales taxes are distributed back to municipal governments, making it difficult for cities and towns to plan for and meet their unique needs. Now, the tools that cities and towns have used to grow and thrive are gone or threatened. More pressure is falling on local property taxes to pay for the services that bring jobs and provide the quality of life that residents seek out and want. Cities and towns must remain a key cog in North Carolina's formula for economic success. That's why the League of Municipalities is moving in a new direction to educate citizens about the important role of municipal governments in economic development and job growth. It's why we need your commitment. It's time to tell our story. It's time to show how we are fostering job growth, clearing a path for commerce, helping create a great quality of life for North Carolinians, whether they live in small towns or big cities. What is our vision? A state where cities and towns continue to foster job growth and clear a path for business and commerce to thrive from Main Street all the way to the capital city. North Carolina cities and towns are the lifeblood of this state's economy. Let's celebrate where we are and what we do. And in doing so, let's ensure we have the freedom to continue to play the same vital role in the state's economic future for generations to come. It's time to bring that vision home.
Okay, I hope that was useful information and informative for them. Let's get a little more specific and talk about the town of Zebulon. And Also, maybe some surprises in our revenues that most people are just simply unaware of, because there's a lot more to it than simply ad valorem tax or property tax. So help us out there.
That's exactly right. So we see from that video that across the state of North Carolina, the responsibility of providing the necessary services like police, fire, and public works is falling increasingly on the property tax. But in the town of Zebulon, that becomes very interesting, and becomes very interesting for a couple reasons. Unlike a lot of cities throughout the state, Zebulon has a unique mix of property that is commercial and industrial, as opposed to the amount of property that's residential. By and large, on average, if you look at most cities, their property tax base, about 70% of that's going to be residential. And as you know, the inverse of that is true in Zebulon, where 70% is commercial industrial and only 30% is residential. Now, I know that there's some city and town managers out there just looking longingly at wishing to have that problem, and that's a really good situation to be in. The thing that presents some unique challenges, however, is when you have such a big percentage of your property tax base that's made of commercial and industrial, it tends to be very reactive to changes in the economy. And as we'll take a look, when we look at the first chart, we can see how much that property tax changes as the economy changes when you have a big chunk of your property base that's commercial/industrial.
Well, you mentioned that there was jealousy, I guess. That's not the word you use. When I tell other mayors, they salivate, you know. But I've always said you can lose one house and manage the situation a lot better than you can lose one industry. So it is a double-edged sword. Fortunately, we haven't really lost industry, but you know, it is something to consider for a balance between the two. So talk just a little bit about this this pie chart on revenues.
Sure. So the interesting thing to look at when we're taking a look at the amount of revenue that comes from property taxes, and we saw a little bit this in the video. When we look at the amount of revenue that we had coming from property tax in the year 2000, it made up about 41% of our revenue that supported the services, and you can see that on that first chart. When we go to the second chart, you can see that 15 years later in 2015, that now property tax makes up 51% of the revenue. So there's a lot more responsibility being put on the property tax to provide those necessary services.
Yeah, and it's important to point out, I mean, just for the knowing that we're talking about a little over $4 million in property tax revenues in 2015, which again was only 50% of our operational monies for the year. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go along.
Yep.
Okay.
And then if we look at the next chart, which focuses specifically about how the property value changes over time, there's two components of property tax. There's the real property tax, which is that tax on buildings and land. And then there's the personal property tax, which is on vehicles and equipment. And real property tax is evaluated every 8 years, so that stays pretty stable. And as we take a look at this chart, we can see that the real property value, it stays pretty flat. There was a big jump in the year 2009, and that reflects the revaluation, and then it just continued to stay up around $500 million up to about 2015. The interesting side of the story is when you take a look at the personal property value, that it mirrored the real property value and went up about 2009. And then about 2009, it just took a really sharp decline up to about 2013. And the reason for that is, unlike the real property tax, the personal property tax is evaluated by the county every single year. And businesses, as you are well aware because you've started up and successfully ran several businesses, when times get tight, you start to ratchet back. Maybe your orders drop, maybe you drop your inventory, you tighten your belt, And businesses don't reinvest in equipment or materials or vehicles. And so there's a big drop, and we saw that in Zebulon. And for a town that has 70% of its tax base in commercial or industrial base, that's a big hit. And for us, that was about to the tune of $600,000 to $700,000. That's about 10% of our budget.
Well, you know, that going back in history, we had the whole harmless money, which I think are now finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I don't want to say that too loud because I don't want to jinx it. But that's when we could no longer tax inventories of businesses and industry
Right.
As property tax. And the state took that ability away from us, thinking it, you know, would encourage business. And at that time, they promised to us that they would make us whole every year. And finally, they got tired of doing that. That's a kind way of saying it. And said, no, we can't do that anymore. So they put a sunset on it. And we Zebulon, we were actually the poster child for the state because we did have so much industry, and we lost the ability to tax those inventories there. So that's a piece of this, and you're right on the other part too. There was a depreciation because people just weren't replacing and upgrading their equipment. They were living with it a little bit longer because the economy was flat. It all boils down to a stew that you have to manage, and it's hard sometimes to manage it and retain the same level of service without increasing taxes.
That's right. It is a challenge. And that brings us to the point of some of the things that we'll talk about at your upcoming retreat. With this big gap and this big drop in property tax revenue, whether it's from the downturn in the economy, whether it's a change from the General Assembly changing how inventory is or is not taxed, we're left with figuring out how to move forward.
Right.
And so the two things that we're going to present to the board is how do we grow the tax base that we have, and how do we protect the tax base that we've got. And when we talk about growing the tax base, we're talking about not only to bring development in, but improve the development that we have. So we've got some projects that we'll share with the board about how to improve the downtown area. We've got some projects to share with the board, like how do we expand and build our greenway system so we increase the value. When we talk about protecting the tax base, what we're talking about is we already have existing responsibilities. We already have existing services that people want and they depend upon. So how can we provide those services more efficiently? And so we're going to get into two big chunks of our responsibility, which is our street system and our fleet system. And so that really lays the groundwork for retreat. We're looking at grow the tax base, protect the tax base, because we've got a revenue dip that we got to be conscientious about and move forward thoughtfully and be good stewards of people's money.
Well, let's talk for a minute about revenues other than tax base. As we mentioned, we're a little over $4 million in 2015 in property taxes, and that was only about 50%, or 51, I think you said 51%. So that leaves a pretty good chunk to come from other sources, and I think a lot of people really, unless you're involved in it, of course, don't understand intergovernmental monies and revenues. So let's talk a little bit about that. We have, of course, sales tax. Mm-hmm. And you know, Joe, a lot of people don't realize that if you spend money in Zebulon or Raleigh or wherever it is, that doesn't mean that sales tax goes to that city. It's not point of sale. So let's talk about that just a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's so there's when the state of North Carolina developed the sales tax code, they put in several articles about where that money starts from, the origin of sale, as you said, and then where it ultimately ends up. And there's not a guarantee that where you spend the money is going to end there. It gets sent to Raleigh, and then it gets distributed across the state. And sometimes that distribution will come back to a town like Zebulon, but a lot of times it gets distributed statewide, and it gets divvied up based on a pro rata share based upon population. So we want people to shop in Zebulon. We like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it all circulates back to Zebulon.
Well, at the state level, there is a little bit of origin, point of origin, or place of purchase in determining how that money is redistributed to the counties. And then the counties have the option to do it based on ad valorem tax base or population. Wake County is purely population. So if we add people, in theory, we would get more tax money. If some other town adds people, in theory, we would get less tax money.
That's right.
So, you know, it's a real seesaw there. But nonetheless, we get roughly $840,000 we did last year. And that was all based on 5,000, in round numbers, 4,500 to 5,000 population. We also get ad valorem, franchise taxes. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So the state of North Carolina has taxes that they'll place on utilities. And when I'm talking about utilities, I'm thinking primarily about electric utilities, but there's also gas line utilities. And based upon the amount of infrastructure that they have literally in the ground, we get a share of a portion of that.
Right. And in our case, that is $370,000 last year. So neither of which is chump change, so to speak. I mean, it's nice money. It adds up. Well, we have other revenues. PAL bill, which is comes from the gasoline tax. Permits and fees. Wake Fire. You want to talk about that, and I'll jump in if I need to.
Sure. So let me talk about the PAL bill for a minute. So as you mentioned, the PAL bill is the gas tax, and the gas tax has been a wonderful mechanism to fund the installation and the maintenance of streets. Over the years, however, that has become more problematic. People are, in some cases, driving less. Cars are becoming more fuel efficient, and in some cases, gas tax has been capped. And so we've got less revenue at the state level coming in from gas tax that then gets circulated to not only put in new roads, but maintain the existing roads. So while the gas tax is a funding mechanism, it has lost its power to keep up with new roads and maintenance of existing roads. The Wake County fire tax that you refer to is every place within the county that's not incorporated. Wake County will put a fire tax in those properties outside the incorporated area, and it's a fire tax. And the town of Zebulon, because it is from a convenience standpoint, from centrally located standpoint, from a response standpoint, for all those reasons, the town of Zebulon's fire department responds to a lot of areas that are outside of Zebulon. And they respond to areas that are in unincorporated areas. And so Wake County gives the town some money to cover those districts that are outside of their responsibility.
Yeah, we actually contract with Wake County when the rural fire department merged with the municipal department. And so we, in fact, then contract to provide that service within the fire district. And therefore, they end up and pay us about 50% of our operational cost. There's some other communities that don't do that. And in some of the other communities, the rural department contracts the town municipal service, and in those communities, the municipal residents pay fire tax. Mm-hmm. So it's just how you want to handle it, but that's the way we chose to handle it. And you know, PAL bill is about $124,000, and fire is about $565,000. We've got development fees, permits, those sort of things that round numbers close to $500,000 again, and then grants. Grants are a big help.
Grants are a really big help. The great thing about grants is that They offer seed money. Projects, well-intentioned, very much needed projects, typically won't get off the ground unless there's some kind of seed money. And so grants are a great way to get projects off the ground. And in some cases, there are grants out there that not only get you off the ground, but they'll sustain you for a couple of years. The things to be mindful of whenever you accept the grants is know that there's going to come a time where you have to pay the piper, so to speak. Right. And grants are a great way to not only start programs, sustain them for a couple of years, but those grants that sustain them for a couple of years, it allows the time for towns to gradually come in and figure out a way to how to fund those programs long term.
And a really good example of that is the Rex Endowment Grant that we had that funds the farmers market for 3 years. We've had 1 year very successful and looking to grow it from there on, but it's a 3-year grant. And part of that grant too was the Greenway Studies. Mm-hmm. That particular grant was not a matching grant. We have others with transportation, which very typically are matching grants. The sidewalk going to the Boys and Girls Club is a good example. That was where we put money in, CDBG money, Community Development Block Grant. I should say what it is. That money was put in it, and then DOT put some money in it as well. So there was some matching components. So grants come in all forms and shape. The bottom line is that with tax base and intergovernmental monies, we are just over $8 million last year was our budget. But again, it's important, I think, for folks to understand that it doesn't all come from their property tax.
That's right.
There's a lot of money that comes from other sources, and population is a big component of that. So,
yep. Well, that's exactly right. Population is an indication of how much your property tax base is growing, but also drives right back to your point with that sales tax. That if you that money comes back to Wake County, and Wake County has a pie with 13 pieces in it, and which of those 13, how much of a portion they get, is dependent upon the population in that particular city.
Right. I think we've talked pretty much about the sales tax distribution and the PAL bill. Again, $840,000 in sales tax for us, and 124, a little more than that in PAL bill, and total revenues, property tax revenues over $4 million. We touched on the history of hold harmless and that. Was there anything else you would want to add to that? I think we pretty well covered it.
I think we did.
Yeah. Okay. One thing we didn't comment on was how the census, when our numbers came in lower, we were hit with hold harmless. We were hit with census numbers because distribution was based on the state's estimate. The census came in and said we didn't have that number, and then we had, I think that hit us for about 200,000, 150, 200, and then we had depreciation, which you spoke about earlier, which was roughly another 150, 200,000. Hold harmless was 600 plus. So, take that out of your budget, and it's tough. But I really think that we've done a pretty darn good job of holding it between the banks, so to speak.
And I think that deserves a heightened level of commentary. You and the board have done a phenomenal job. When you take a look at all those factors at play, the hold harmless, the depreciation, the census recalibration, dropping your population so much, all that really formed a financial perfect storm. And to be able to not only figure that out, but maintain services on top of that, that's quite an accomplishment.
Well, we were able to do that in large part because we had been very frugal and had developed and maintained a very good fund balance to work with, rainy day fund, if you will, and we were able to use that along with making other modifications to get us through. As I stated early in the show, I hope now we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and I feel like we really do have some good development. We have some good residential development coming on board. BB&T project is I guess wrapped up now. Glaxo's doing a very nice expansion. Namako, Noma Cork are looking for expansion. So there's just some really good things coming along that that's going to help us. But again, we have to keep, I think, an eye on bringing that balance around, and that population growth is really going to help us.
It will. Absolutely
in
will.
distribution. Well, what can we look at future? I know you and I are going to do a couple of more shows on this issue and dig into different items. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure. So I know we talked about all the different components of the revenue stream that support the services for the town of Zebulon's citizens. But what we will focus on in the coming years, and will be a lead into retreat, is what are those particular projects and policies that we can look at that grow the tax base and protect the tax base. And so I've identified those 4 projects and policies as streets, fleet, downtown, and greenways. And the street and fleet is really a discussion about, we already have a responsibility to maintain the streets we've got. We've got a responsibility to maintain the fleet system that in some cases protects and serves our citizens like fire and police, but also maintains service levels to keep the streets clean and patched and so on and so forth. So what are the things that we can do to make sure that we are using those resources, and we're not making those resources define and demand where we go. We want to be good stewards of the infrastructure and the vehicles that we've got. So stay on top of vehicle maintenance, make replacements when necessary, and just be good stewards of tax dollars. So that, when we say protect the tax base, that's what we're really talking about. The other 2 projects we'll talk about, the downtown and the greenways, are really a conversation about how to grow the tax base, and not necessarily from a expanding outward. I think that will naturally occur, and as you mentioned, we already have development that is underway, some development that has completed, more development that's coming, and that's going to be the expansion. That's the market that's recovering. These conversations are really more, how do we invest within the town limits and even specific sections of town to increase the value. So we're going to have some future discussions about how to make investments in downtown, and how to get the greenway system that was funded off the ground by the Rex endowment, but how to actually get asphalt, or in some cases natural trails, into the ground. So those are the things we'll be talking about in our next meetings.
Nuts and bolts, bricks and mortar. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing, you know. I mean, you can have all these wonderful studies and put them on the shelf and let them collect dust, and why did you do them? So implementation is paramount. Oh, Joe, anything else you'd like to add? I think we've sort of run that rabbit.
No, I think this was good. Thank you.
Okay, good. You're welcome. Tell you how delighted I am to have you on board, and I appreciate it. I've really enjoyed working with you.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Tell the people that as well. You know, I hope you found this information useful, and we'll see you next month.